Ideology. Mick Murray here with Drew Stedman, coming to you from Waco, Texas, and Kona, Hawaii. And we continue to apologize for the intermittent nature of the releases now of the podcast, but we're just doing it as we're able to sync up, and as we have content that we feel is worth putting out into the stratosphere. So here we are. And there's some exciting things that have been happening in the world of Christendom here in the United States. And so we're going to unpack some of that today. And I don't know how many, this might be just a one-off, Drew, or potentially a couple episodes unpacking this data. But why don't you just dive right in?
Thanks, Mick. Well, for those who have followed Ideology, you've probably heard me saying for several years now that I am convinced revival is coming. And my rationale for that is I believe that secularism, which go back, there's plenty of episodes we've done defining secularism as a belief system. I believe that secularism is leaving people empty, lonely, addicted, and broken. And so now we have, really a whole generation that has been raised largely within a failed belief system, and they're paying a terrible price for it. I think we see that in a lot of different ways. And so what's happening and what I have sensed is going to happen, and I think now what we're actually seeing empirically is that there's a large wave of spiritual hunger. And I'm not sure if you realize that yet. I don't know where everybody's listening or what your context is. For some of you, you might be like, wow, yeah, we see it. Others, you might be thinking, really? But I see it. I see it especially when we start looking at college and youth. I just see there being a significant spiritual hunger, and today I want to unpack, why I think that is, and I think a lot of it has to do with the brokenness of the world that we're in. But before we get there, I want to highlight a report I saw on Barna, and David Kinnaman, the president, or I actually don't know his official title, but one of the main leaders with Barna. I heard this relayed to me of he was the guy for so many years that everyone is saying revival, and he's looking at the data saying, that's not what we're seeing. But now it's flipped. Now where people seem more gloomy about the future of the church, he's actually saying, guys, there's something significant going on. So I'm going to read this quote. We can drop the link in the show notes if you want to look at the report for yourself. But here's a quote from Barna. While headlines often focus on religious decline, new Barna research uncovers an unexpected and significant trend. A growing number of people are making personal commitments to follow Jesus. According to our latest data, 66% of U.S. adults now say they've made a personal commitment to Jesus Christ that is still important in their life today, and that marks a 12 percentage point increase since 2021. So just pause. That's crazy. That significant of an increase in 4 years. That's wild. If you did the math on that and extrapolate that, that's a huge number of people. And that was when commitment levels reached their lowest point in 25 years of tracking, was in 2021. And it was a 54% answered that question of they've made a personal commitment to Jesus that remains significant. Demographically, the biggest drivers of this spiritual resurgence are younger generations, particularly Gen Z and millennials. Among Gen Z men, commitment to Jesus jumped 22 percentage points between 2021 and 2025. Millennial men saw a similar spike of 18 percentage points. And while women also showed growth, it was more modest, around 8 to 13 percentage points. Notably, the largest increases are coming from people outside the church. Among those who do not attend church or have distanced themselves from religious identity, the personal connection to Jesus is increasing. Non-Christians saw a 10% point increase in commitment, while practicing Christians remained flat. Crazy. This report is if you just sit with that, it's whoa. We're seeing large numbers of people turning to Jesus, and they're being driven by specifically younger men, but also women as well. It's just men in the lead, and that's remarkable to me. In my lifetime, I can't think of a time where it was men leading the way in responding to Jesus. And then in particular, it's younger generations of people. So even, Mick, you and I are old millennials. This isn't even referring necessarily to our peer groups, but this is us looking at people, I would think 30 and under. We're millennial, I guess, but it's really that the locus of this appears to be happening, I would think, in the 18 to 30 range. Any immediate reflections, or I'm not sure what you've come across with some of this data, Mick?
Yeah, no, when I read that data, I was surprised. I did not see that coming, and especially so dramatically. It's not like, if you look at the data going back all the way to 20, the early 2000s to the early 2010s, it follows a general kind of curve of decline then through 2021 without many, dips and peaks. And then all of a sudden there's this sharp reversal, and not, yeah, like you said, not an insignificant one. And so I don't know. I don't know that I had my ear to the ground sufficiently well enough to anticipate that, or even to assign reasons for such a sharp reversal. So yeah, I was surprised. I think I was secondarily surprised by the demographic, that it is being driven by kind of the 30 and unders with a genuine hunger for spirituality, and in particular Jesus Christ. And super exciting. I've got four kids in that demographic, and I'm honestly just at a microcosm seeing it among them and their peers, but I would not have projected that out, to the broader society. So I'm curious, what I have my suspicions, but I'm curious, Drew, what you think is driving that kind of reversal.
Yeah. I'd have to answer that. It's just the Lord, it's a work of the Spirit. So I think attributing any human cause to it is probably the wrong approach. But I do think there's some dynamics that are going on that have made people particularly hungry. And that's what I want to get into today, and probably next week as well, is how there's something in the Christian story that as people are experiencing the brokenness of this world, as they're having an encounter with the Holy Spirit, what's needed? What's the message that this generation needs, and what might they be finding? And my purpose in communicating this is a few different reasons, and we can get into these over the next few weeks. One of them is just encouraging. It's encouraging to maybe recalibrate our understanding of what's going on. Another one sharpens the task for us as, Mick, you and I as leaders in churches, but I think this applies to anybody, you could be of this demographic, and if you're following Jesus, you got to be ready to disciple people and maybe plant churches. If this is really happening, that's a lot of people to disciple. And if you're a little older, I think we have to say, both you and I are in our early 40s now, and it's, kind of stepping into increasing roles of leadership. And so are we prepared to steward our part, however small that may be, and in leading well and preparing well so that we're creating space for this. And, I just think there's a whole host of questions that arise. And many of these are things that we've tackled over the years on this podcast that I hope can contribute to, some of those conversations. But today, another purpose of me wanting to do this is I want to try to pinpoint what are some things going on under the surface that have made people hungry. And then what is the message in the gospel that they need to hear? And how is it that Jesus is the answer? Of course, we know that he's always the answer, no matter what the issue may be. But I think maybe we can see enough under the hood to identify some areas of where there's great need in our society that's provoking spiritual hunger, and where the gospel speaks to that. And I think that might help us as we're discipling people, and even maybe some of the ways that we're communicating and the messages we're sharing. And, maybe this week or next week, I think there's some pretty significant ramifications for church practice and discipleship that also are tied into this. And so if we can take a step back, and it's impossible to analyze your situation in real time, it'll take historians in the future to probably give it the best shot. But as those living it out and undergoing cultural change, even since we started the podcast, we've gone through crazy cultural change, both challenging and encouraging. So the challenge is how do we apply that? How do we make sense of that? And how do we lead as far as best we know? What's the Holy Spirit doing in the church that we can participate in our part in leadership to steward what he's doing in real time? So here is a central premise that, if you've listened to ideology like more than one time, you've heard this from me, is that there is a secular gospel that is operative in the world that our culture has bought into wholesale. And the gospel message of the world is to live true to yourself, that there is this mystical sense of self, and in myself, there is identity, there's purpose, there's meaning. But the only way I can tap into that is by retreating into the self, discovering who I really am, living accordingly, and whatever it takes for me to live according to that interior sense of self, that becomes my telos in life. Like that's what I am striving towards, is actualizing this self-identity. And so my thesis has been that's the gospel message that permeates our culture, and just about anyone who has been raised in modern America has been raised with that gospel message. And that includes if you grew up in the church. Maybe some of you grew up in this, alternative Christian radical discipleship community where that message was balanced by the message of the gospel, but I would still wager that you were affected by that message. And what I see is happening in the world today is our chickens are coming home to roost, to use the old phrase. A culture that was raised on that message, we've applied it in our society now for long enough to be able to make sense of the fruit of that message and its impact on the world around us. And to kind of anticipate where I'm going, I believe that message has left us increasingly broken, lonely, and empty, and it's provoking anxiety in our culture. And that the further we have embraced that message, the more broken we have become, which is then provoking spiritual hunger in a generation of people who that's all they've ever known. And I think they're the ones on the front end of living in a world that's wholesale given to the secular gospel that has left them broken and empty, and has made them hungry for something new.
Yeah. Yeah, that should be a very common refrain for longtime listeners, and it's sad to see it play out, I think, in real time. I'm curious, Drew, what association you would give COVID at the same time as like an accelerant for those who've kind of grown up on that secular doctrine, that secular gospel, and then the I use the word accelerant, but just the pain point of COVID, kind of bringing that to the surface and accelerating the brokenness of that gospel and the inability of a secular narrative to answer the deeper questions of life. But I think it's an incredible time that we live in. Even just 4 or 5 years ago, we addressed a little bit more like pure materialism, pure naturalism. That was a holdover of some of the new atheists from the early 2000s. And I don't hear much of that, at least in the mainstream, very much at all anymore. It's as if, that truth from the scriptures that God has put eternity in the hearts of men. He's hidden eternity in our hearts. I think people have come to grips with the fact that it's a hard pill to swallow, that we are just the product of time, chance, and chemistry. And so there's kind of this been emerging vacuum where, out in Silicon Valley, there's kind of this transhumanist movement. And it's amazing reading some of that literature, how close it gets to Christian eschatology and Christian anthropology, just without Jesus, and it's just kind of this, man's attempt to fill in the blanks. But there's a general spiritual hunger, it seems, across society. And I agree with you wholeheartedly that it's a work of the Spirit, that Jesus himself is filling that gap. It's an amazing thing to be a part of.
Yeah, I was talking with a friend who was at a conference. They were analyzing some of this information, and he relayed to me. I wasn't there, and I didn't see any of the notes from it, but how they're kind of, one of their points was that with younger generations, it's the message of peace that comes with the gospel is what's leading the way, followed by hope. I wonder if purpose might be in there as well, or identity. But it seems that what's not the main question is truth. And some of you may hear that negatively, some of you may hear that positively. But it's, it doesn't mean that truth is irrelevant. It just means that's not what's driving people at the moment on a large scale. Is not the question of, how do I rebut my atheist professor's claims? And I need to, kind of the God is not dead movies. And I'm not trying to bash anybody, but I'm like, that's just doesn't seem to be the driver right now. I think the driver right now is I live in a world that's left me really broken and anxious and empty. Who can give me peace? And where can I find hope? Where can I find identity? Where can I find belonging? Where can I find purpose? And truth needs to be part of that. And truth is grounded to all those questions. And so it doesn't mean we suddenly become post-truth or something like that. It's helpful to know what's the emotional driver of what's going on. And yeah, I have to say, when I heard that, it resonated with me. I probably need to sit with it a little longer. And today we'll unpack a few thoughts related to that idea. But I did find that interesting. And to your original question, Mick, I would say COVID, I think you nailed it. I think it was an accelerator or a trigger event. And so the way I see it is there was societal currents that are in many ways centuries in the making, and they were going on under the surface. And if you knew where to look, or in hindsight, we can go back and look and see how those were developing. But I think there was probably several events over the last decade where things reached a head, and what was building under the surface was suddenly thrust into the spotlight. COVID being, the most disruptive to people's daily lives. And, and so I think it definitely accelerated things. What I also think it's careful to balance that with is the change would have happened anyway. And if it wasn't COVID, something else would have happened. There would have eventually been a trigger event. And so I think it would be incorrect to blame it all on COVID or political events or whatever, people want to do. I think that the answer probably starts with cultural trends that are decades and centuries in the making, and then societal trigger events that accelerate what's already going on under the surface. So what I want to do is I want to take a moment, and I want to take the secular gospel and I want to contrast it with what some of the great fathers in church history would have said about the secular gospel. They don't live now, so the messages they were interacting with were different. But they did speak about, where do we find our identity, our hope, and peace. And I think it's intriguing to hear their voices and compare that to the secular gospel. So I'm going to start with Athanasius. I've quoted him many times, but one of the first great theologians of the church, writing in the early 4th century, and I think his career maybe spanned the very tail end of the 3rd century, but early 4th century. And one of the key concepts that he introduces is the idea that we remain. And what he's talking about there is like we're participating in something. We're remaining in something. And for him, we can either remain in God. And so, in other words, there's a participation of me with God where I'm finding my life with God, or what's happening to me is I am remaining. I am, and using the word remain, it's like I'm living within. I am participating with something different, which is non-being. It's the absence of being. And I'll introduce that idea here in a second. But that's what he refers to as evil. And, I like Khalid Anatolios, one of Athanasius's interpreters. He talks about idolatry, and he defines it as a systematic recapitulation of a larger schema. And what he means by that is he's taking just this microcosm of idolatry, which is rather than me worshiping the God that created the universe, that created me, that created the world, who from the outside has ascribed meaning to us. Instead, what I've done is I've created a God in my own image, or in the image of the created world, that I have control over. And now I serve that little g God that I have created, and I am remaining with that God. And I am putting my identity and my hope and my purpose, it's getting wrapped up in this God that is a creation of humanity. And I'm basically reliving the story of humanity's estrangement from the true God when I am worshiping idols. And so what happens to us as people is we create these idols, and then we become enslaved to the idols that we have created. And idols are cruel masters. They lead us into this realm of non-being. In other words, I am losing my identity. I am losing my substance. I am losing the essence of what makes me truly human. And the more I serve an idol, the less of a true being in the sense I become. And I'm not trying to say that somebody's humanity is erased. As long as you are living, you are still fully human. But it's a movement that's taking place where you're drifting further and further and further away from the very thing that's meant to give you life and substance. And you're instead serving something that's oppressing you and enslaving you. And so I think of that, and I look at our culture today. Our idols look different, but I see so many people, and they're so addicted. They're so anxious. They're so lonely. And this idea of non-being really resonates with me, because they've been cut off from the very thing that gives them life. And so when you look at their lives, these things that are intended to be there so that you're walking in the essence of true humanity are absent, and instead we're slaves to these idols that our culture has created for us. And so in a minute, I'm going to tie all this in together with the message, the gospel message of our world. But I want to keep going. Augustine, he also views evil as privation. And what he means by that is that evil itself has no substance. And so sometimes we think of good as substantive and evil as substantive. For Augustine, evil has no substance. That's the point of what it is. It's the very lack of substance. It's nothingness. It's chaos. It's emptiness. That's what evil is. It is everything that is cut off from the life of God is that which is evil. And so what happens is when I am living in evil, it's not that there's even something active that I'm pursuing. Instead, it's that I am cut off from everything. And the more evil in which I live, the further cut off from God that I am, the less reality, the less tethering, the less substance or essence of what it means to be human. That then becomes my story. And so, of course, he's not denying that there are active things that occur in this world that we would attribute to evil. He's just saying underneath all of that is a substance-less world. It's a world that is a lack of any kind of substance, any kind of meaning, any kind of purpose. It's just emptiness, darkness, chaos, blackness. Like that's what evil is. And so evil in the world is manifest as we are moving away from the substance we have in God and towards this lack of substance that is just emptiness and evil. That's what he's defining here as what it means when he says that evil is privation of the good. Mick, any reflections or thoughts?
Yeah, no, what's standing out to me as you're talking about that is, I think at least in the 80s, like growing up, 80s and 90s, I would have thought of more of like conversations around behavior and behavior modification. This is just follow me for a moment in terms of like critiques of Christianity. And it seems what's happening, even your comment about how what's driving people to the Christian frame is this pursuit of peace and maybe you could argue substance in the form of hope. And it's not this kind of apologetic debate around truth and certainly not around, behavior modification, or we've talked in the past about this desire to be socially kind of upwardly mobile by being a part of the church or associating with Christianity. And just that deeper longing for substance and the ability or the inability for materialism or just idolatry is really what that is. Materialism just being one form of that to provide that. And people encountering substance in the person of Jesus Christ. This is what was going through my mind as you were talking about it. I have some other thoughts forming, but why don't you keep going?
No, I think I see it exactly the same way, because the result of where people are, the more that we have embraced the emptiness of non-being, or the more that we have cut ourselves off from remaining in the life of God, the more that we have started to worship idols. And I think the number one idol in a secular culture is self-idolatry. The more that we've done all of those things, what has happened to us is we have become empty, anxious, addicted, lonely. And I read those quotes from Athanasius, Augustine, you could go to Gregory of Nyssa, so many others, and I imagine from reading them, that's what they would have happened to us. That the more that we think that our life and our substance is found interiorly to ourselves, apart from God, the less human we actually become. And we're cut off from the very things that make us who we are by walking down that road and trying to remain within ourselves rather than remaining in God. And so they would not have been surprised by all the things that we see in culture because we've cut ourselves off from the very source of our life.
Yeah,
and I think you go for it.
No, well, yeah, no, the thought was slowly forming. And I think what I was trying to get at is that, like take sin, for instance. I think in the past, the message has been, like sin makes you a bad person. You're morally corrupt. But like hearing you unpack Athanasius and Augustine, it's less that sin makes you a bad person, and it's like sin makes you an unperson.
Right.
It doesn't just corrupt you, it destroys you. It hollows you out. It's vacuous. And I think people are gaining a language for that. And just like, cold is the absence of heat, you were saying, dark is the absence of light. It's like um, uh, sin is really the absence of connection with God. Anyway, that's just
Yeah.
trying to connect the dots there.
No, I think you're 100% right with that. And maybe I could phrase it as I think, going back a couple generations, we would think of sin as moral culpability and rebellion. And it's true. Like both of those things
Uh-huh.
are true, and I don't want to I don't want to swing so far the other way that we lose that aspect of what sin is. But the message there is like, don't be bad. Or even, you think about the idea of guilt, right? It's like you are bad. You don't want to be bad anymore. You've done bad things. And so let me talk to you about how God can make you good.
Uh-huh.
And I don't say that to belittle that message. I believe that message is entirely true. And I think there's many people where that's the message they need to hear. And whether you understand it or not, that message is part and parcel to the gospel. So it's right. It's just that's the way that we have interpreted the gospel almost exclusively, though. And this is what I'm trying to get at, to where we've missed this other side of what is. And sin is destruction. Sin is the absence of being. And that has a different component to it. And I think you can find this in Romans chapter 1 and 2, where Paul's describing this. Actually, you have to keep reading in 3, 4, 5. But he's unpacking this, where he's treating sin and he's addressing the Jewish community. And it is for them moral culpability. Like you knew the good. You were a child of the covenant and you were unable to live according to it. And so sin for you is the fact that you chose not to do what God told you to. And now look at what's happened. But then he's also addressing the Gentiles, who are the idol worshipers. And his message to them is you actually didn't know. So it's not that you are morally culpable in the sense that you knew better and you chose the opposite, but it doesn't matter because it still is killing you. And whether you knew you had a sickness or not, the sickness is still destroying you, and it's destroying you from the inside out. And so if we had people that, are maybe born 60 years ago or whatever, like you probably knew what you were doing was sinful. You did it anyway, and it still messed you up. And you do have that regret of, I feel guilty because I chose this path. And hopefully you found the message of reconciliation and forgiveness that comes with the gospel. And, that guilt was washed away, the blood of Christ. Like, praise God for that. And I think that's where some of the gospel presentation, Billy Graham's message or so many others was so appealing because it's tapping into that. But I see what's happening now is we have a whole generation of people. What's driving them to Jesus is not that they feel guilty per se, but it's that they're experiencing the ramification of destruction in their life. And they're seeing this drift. I just think of people where it's like, you just look at addiction, whether it's pornography, whether it's drug, alcohol, all kinds of, such an addicted way of living. And, I was talking with some friends yesterday, and it's like so many kids today. I don't want to minimize that people made choices, but man, what people were influenced by at a very early age, often against their will, that now they're trapped in, and it's very difficult to get out of it. It's like, is there still moral culpability? For sure. And I'm not going to dismiss that. I will never back off that message of whether it's me or anybody else. Like we need to own our sin. But I think we also need to acknowledge that in a way we have to almost relate to people recognizing you were born in a neo-idol worshiping culture where from your very earliest memories that was shaped inside of you, and it's brought a tremendous amount of destruction in your life. And, and now as you're coming to grips with that, you're starting to look around you and see the world, and you're like, this isn't working. And just like we saw throughout history, pagan cultures consistently turn to Jesus for this exact same reason, is that idols are terrible masters. You don't want to worship an idol. Idols bring destruction. I see people, we'll talk about maybe in our next episode, kind of this quest for transcendence, and it's almost like they're have this nostalgic idea of their understanding, at least, of their pagan ancestors who lived in harmony with the world, and kind of this paganism ideas or concepts. And it's like they forget that their ancestors sacrificed their children to river gods. Like idols are terrible, and they bring about terrible destruction. And I think we're seeing a lot of people where sadly they're realizing that. So maybe another way of saying this is there's a progression of, the message being don't sin because you're bad if you do. to don't sin because it will destroy you. And I think where we are now is actually even further than that. Sin is destroying you. And the message that person needs to hear is, I'm so sorry. And let's go to God. Let's get you delivered. Let's get you free. Let's talk about the restoring work of Jesus that can overcome all these years that have been wasted and lost, and the result of emptiness and this quest for identity and purpose. And that's that message of peace and that message of hope that I think is resonating so deeply, is because people are trapped and they have no way out of it. Like, they see the death of sin at work in their lives, at work in our culture, and they want to find freedom and they want to find life. And, at some point you do have to grapple with guilt. You have to grapple with your own choices. And I'm not backing off of that. But this is where I see this message going.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it makes me think of one of our mutual friends is a pastor up in the Northwest, and he said years ago, I mean, this is coming out of COVID, he said that the culture wars of the past, he said, have not borne the fruit by and large that he had, that I think well-meaning believers had hoped to see. And the image that he gave was, secularism is a sinking ship, and rather than continuing to blow holes in it, it's already sinking. I'd rather be a winsome life raft that as people are going down, we do have that message of reconciliation, of belonging, of peace, of hope, so that, as people realize that they're on a sinking ship, do they want to jump on the raft that has been blowing holes in its broadside, or do they want to jump on a raft that is living out a version of the thing that they've been chasing this whole time, which is that wholeness and connection with God, with one another.
Yeah, and I think that's such a good point you're making, because it's easy to take shots at secularism. And it's important, one level we need to show it for what it is and analyze it. But what's going to carry the day is not that. What's going to carry the day is who has hope and who has life. And, so I look at this revival movement, I'm so encouraged by it, but I'm also a little sobered by it, because who's going to tell the better story? Who is going to provide the alternative for people? And I hope and pray it's the church, and it's a church that's alive. And I hope and pray that it's churches that aren't just a flash in a pan of, some bigger conferences for a few years, but it's enduring churches that make disciples, that retrain people in discipleship community and belonging and fellowship, how to embrace our true identity as followers of Jesus, and the restoration of families and the restoration of humans from the inside out, deliverance and freedom, and all of that is what's needed. But just because there's hunger, that's not a given. And I think that's where we have to step up to the plate and be willing to step into that vacuum. As we keep going, this concept of non-being, do want to acknowledge I'm borrowing this from a theologian named Paul Tillich, who I have profound disagreements with on some pretty major things in theology. So if you're a theologian, you can maybe guess why. But I do find he does a lot of existential analysis of culture, and I think he saw some of these things 100 years coming. And so I disagree with his solutions to it. But it's in the history of the church, this idea of non-being, but he really draws that out. And his core idea of even the incarnation, which again, I don't agree with his view of the incarnation in some major areas, but really viewing Jesus as the true being, and contrasting to a world of non-being. And I think that idea I do resonate with, and I think is an important message. So let me unpack everything we've talked about and go back to the premise of the gospel of secularism. And this is where, hopefully you're charting the logic of hyper-individualism and the deification of the self, or self-idolatry. The logic of that is that the self is the locus of our being, and therefore we actualize our true humanity by moving further and further inward into our true self. And so this movement is where we discover our true essence. It's where we get identity and all those things. And so what then happens to people is when they experience difficulty, the solution that we are able to give them is, your problem is that you need more retreat into the self, more self-actualization, more inward movement. I just think that's like, you got to go there, right? It's like, hey, you're sick. Let's give you some more poison. And the poison that we gave you isn't working enough. So now drink it even further. And let's cut ties with everything that gives you meaning in life. And let's just, everything about your identity, your gender, your family, your whatever it may be. Like, we're going to cut all of that off, and you just got to find yourself in there somewhere. That's kind of the logic of that way of thinking. To me, it's actually very rational if I accept the premise of the secular gospel. And, I contrast that then with Augustine or Athanasius that would say the retreat into the self is the problem. That's where you got yourself into trouble in the first place. That's why you're so messed up. That's why you're so anxious, is because you keep retreating into yourself rather than finding your life in God. And this is where I want to balance this thought, but I got to say it at least, is I have concerns about therapeutic culture on this point. And my concern is, what's the goal? And I'm not saying therapy is bad. I think therapy can be very helpful for people, and I'm really grateful. I know a lot of people where that's been tremendously helpful. And if you're a therapist, thank you. And I recommend it in so many cases. But we do have to pay attention to what's the point of our therapy. Is the point for me to self-actualize my interior sense of self in a world that has no intrinsic meaning? And if so, what's going to happen in the end is you're going to end up way worse off than you were to start. And I don't want to discount the real challenges that people face. But ultimately, am I trying to lead you further and further into yourself, or am I trying to help you actualize yourself in who you are in Christ? And again, I'm not throwing therapy under the bus. I think you can be an amazing therapist within a Christian worldview, and I think we need more of you. But I also think if you're not careful, you can adopt therapeutic culture messages, which essentially are saying the result of your problems in life is you're not self-focused enough, so go embrace your interior sense of self more. And I'm just going to say it. That's going to leave you more anxious, more broken, more empty in the long run. At least according to the heritage of the Christian faith, is that's not the way that you find life.
Yeah, again, if Christian anthropology is accurate, then, we are derivative of an eternal being in whom we find our life. And so cut off from that, we move further and further into non-being, to use, Augustine or Athanasius, their language. And so, yeah, maybe a sad, words are escaping me today, a sad byproduct of therapeutic culture is to move people further and further into the root of the problem, which is the turn in on the self, as opposed to reconnection with the source of life in the person of Jesus. And I've been thinking about this recently, just in my own journey of kind of being overly analytical and dealing with doubts throughout the years, and really, I was kind of rereading some C.S. Lewis, and he was challenging his readers to follow our assumptions to their logical ends. And it is, man, to really try to conceive of the world in the secular frame is extremely bleak, and I think it produces compassion in me for my friends, family members, and others who don't have the hope of Jesus, and people throughout the centuries trying to grapple with that bleakness in a world that's completely devoid of meaning. I don't know. I think it behooves us as believers to really reflect on the implications of our beliefs and how dramatically different the narrative is, the hope. It is just utterly hopeless to really begin to grapple. You read Nietzsche, and he went mad by the end of his life. I think honestly so. I actually appreciate, if you will, his kind of courageous attempt to follow his assumptions out to their logical ends, and it ends in madness. I think it only can. So may it breed compassion in us.
Yeah.
As we have these conversations and move forward, into the future.
And I think that last word is the key word, is compassion. I think the message is comfort. It's hope. Like, that's what people need, and it's peace. And that's what we find in the gospel message. And so let me, maybe take the last few minutes here and let me try to tell a better story of what it means to be human and how we find life. And I think the Christian story would acknowledge that we, as an individual human and as humanity kind of writ large, we exist in the tension of two realities. We are created in the image of God. And in other words, there is a substantive nature of who we are, and the essence of what it means to be human is found in God. And at the same time, we exist in a fallen world, or a world under the rule of sin, or however you want to phrase that. And what that means is that we have this high honor of who it is that we've been created in his image. And at the same time, we abuse the creaturely freedom that was given to us to indulge in our self-idolatry. And that happens to me as an individual person. I do that, but that happens to our society. We construct whole societies that have done that. And left unchecked, inevitably what will happen to us is we will continue to slide further into the self and into that state of non-being. And so we're kind of capturing this other angle of sin, of its guilt and its destruction and its emptiness. And so this is where it leaves us. And so, you fast forward, what is our hope has to be not me looking into myself, but that's actually the very source of the problem was the fact that I did look into the self. And so my solution has to be somebody stepping in from the outside. The theologian Hans Boersma, who is interestingly, he's a Neoplatonist, which I not necessarily fully, but I still think you can kind of appreciate his point. And he has a lot of really great stuff to say. But he talks about this more on a cultural level, but I love this quote. He says, "I agree with the common perception that post-modernity is little more than modernity coming home to roost. Both, I believe, are predicated on the abandonment of a pre-modern sacramental mindset in which the realities of this worldly existence pointed to greater eternal realities in which they sacramentally shared. And once modernity abandoned a participatory or sacramental view of reality, the created order became unmoored from its origin in God, and the material cosmos began its precarious drift on the flux of nihilistic waves." And man, I like a lot of vocabulary, but it's like this haunting image, of we're unmoored. It's just that emptiness. We're just drifting further and further into the emptiness because we've been cut off from the very life source in which we are meant to participate. And so when he's talking about kind of a sacramental sharing, what he's talking about is like in the created world, we're participating and sharing in the eternal world and the life of God. And that's where you kind of see as Neoplatonism is really looking at God as the absolute. He's the absolute of humanity, the absolute of goodness, the absolute of peace, or whatever thing you want to put in there. And then we participate in God, in who he is. And so if I want goodness, love, peace, joy, all those things, I only find them by participating in who God is. And when I cut myself off from God, that's when I become unmoored. I start drifting in this world that has no meaning and no purpose and emptiness. And that really sets up who is Jesus. He is God and he is man. And in Jesus, we see the perfection of what does it mean to be human. And he is a human that is completely and fully God. And, I can't be that in the same way that Jesus was. He actually is God in substance. I am in God through participation. But still, it's a format for us where here's what we're meant to be. So when we look at Jesus, I'm actually looking in the mirror of who I'm supposed to be. And I see him. And so in a world that has no meaning, in a world that has no hope, in a world that has no purpose, I can look to Jesus, and that provides a fixed point. And that suddenly is by having something outside of me, it actually tethers me again. It gives me peace again. I'm not drifting on these waves of emptiness anymore. I'm not unmoored from what it means to be human, but I have a fixed point that's beyond me. And why I'm able to have peace is because it's no longer me that is intended to give me identity. I actually find my identity outside of me. And that sets me free from my emptiness, from my anxiety, from my loneliness. It doesn't mean I might not still deal with those things in this life. But by having a fixed point that's beyond me, suddenly I have a frame of reference that actually orients me to everything else. And it gets better because I actually participate in his essence. And I become who I am in Christ by the Spirit. And so rather than remaining, to use Athanasius, remaining in myself, where I'm just looking further and further and further into the self to find life, now what's happening is I'm in Christ. And by the Spirit, I'm moving further and further and further into him. And every single part of that movement, the further I move into him, the more human I actually become, the more of my real identity I actually become. And I'm receiving meaning. I'm not making my own meaning, but I'm being given meaning. I'm not randomly trying to craft some identity out of nothingness. It's like, the equivalent of building a sandcastle that I know is going to get washed away in the morning. I just have this short time on earth where I'm going to try to make something nice that I know is going to be gone. I mean, what a terrible, empty way to leave. Like, no wonder we're all so anxious. But no, I have something that's eternal, that's bigger than me, and I'm participating in him in this life and for eternity. And like, that's where I have this grounding that gives me this eternal peace and purpose and belonging that anchors me. And so, maybe said simply, to actualize my full identity, I have to be in Christ by the Spirit so that my identity rests outside of just what I have inside of me. And that's a counterintuitive point in a world where we've always been taught to find ourselves in ourselves. Actually, I don't find myself in myself. That's how I live anxiously. I find myself, I find peace by finding myself in Christ, who then grounds me and gives me a firm foundation to stand on and imparts an identity to me that's beyond me. And the more and more that we get that, then suddenly that unlocks so many other things. That unlocks deliverance from idolatry and demonic influence and addiction and all of that. And of course, there's a process for all of us of walking that out. That unlocks purpose and meaning. I could go on down the line, but it starts with that movement to find ourselves in Christ. And that's where the peace is, because of who I am in Jesus.
It's good. Maybe that's a good place to put a pin in it for today. Thank you, Drew. It's a powerful message, and hopefully, this episode resonates with you, and maybe even, you could turn around and share it with a friend or two to encourage them. There are plenty of negative messages even around the church today, and this is a wonderful trend that we see the Spirit working, and even just at a personal level. Drew, you note here that we don't make an identity; we have an identity as followers of Christ because it's located outside of the self in the person of Jesus Christ. So may we live in that reality, seated with Christ in heavenly places, not vying for position, but positionally situated with God to then turn back around and to be his hands and his feet. So thank you for your ongoing listenership. Thanks for tuning in today, and we will catch you next time on Ideology.